Hello everyone, I'm Michaela, and once again, welcome to Likenhood Reads. Thank you for joining me, and I'm wishing everyone a happy new year. It's officially 2022. I'm coming at you with a 2021 reading stats video. So this is really just a little looking back about what I read last year in 2021, the goals I reached, how many books I read, what kind of books I read, and just letting you know kind of where I stand going into 2022. Hopefully this video won't be too terribly long, just a quick overview of my 2021 reading stats, because I would also like to do 2 more videos in January, one being a New Year book haul to let you know what I got for Christmas as far as books go. And also I wanted to try Jan Agaton's new January book tag that she just made up this year. So I hope to do both of those this month as well. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. I read 88 books in 2021, which is way more than I originally anticipated. At the beginning of the year, I set a Goodreads reading challenge goal of only 60 books. So I was just getting back into reading on the tail end of 2020 and just starting to gain momentum, and I wasn't sure how many I was going to be able to read, so I kind of underestimated, obviously. And reading really took over a big part of my life this year in 2020, or last year in 2021. So I totally exceeded my goal of 60 books around the summertime, and in June or July I had already read around 60-ish books, so I knew I was going to have to up my goal because I still had basically 6 months of the year left. I believe I upped it to like 75, and when I had already surpassed that in October, I went ahead and said, what the heck, let's up it to 80. So on Goodreads, I had a goal of 80 books in 2021, ultimately, after a couple of changes. But in the end, I ended up even exceeding that, and I read a total of 88 books this year. Now, when I say I read 88 books, that also includes short stories and novellas. Some people don't count short stories and novellas towards their reading goals, but you know, it's my life, it's my reading goal, my reading challenge. I just decide to do whatever works best for me. So some of these going towards that goal of 88 and that total of 88 are short stories and novellas, not full-length novels. Okay, getting into a little bit about genre. Most of what I read this year were sci-fi and fantasy books, which is what this channel is about. That's most of what I read in general, so not really a surprise there. But I read more fantasy books than I did sci-fi, even though towards the end of the year I definitely got into a sci-fi mood, and I'm still in a sci-fi mood right now. Sorry, there's a dog barking. Most of what I read was fantasy, with sci-fi coming in second in terms of genre. I read, let's see, 4 queer rom-com books, like contemporary rom-coms. I read 4 of those this year. They're nice little palate cleansers in between larger fantasy books. Just because they're quick, they're funny, easy to read, especially on audiobook. I enjoy reading them on audiobook. And I thought I had read more than that. Honestly, it felt like I did, but I ended up reading about 4 of those this year. I only read 2 nonfiction books, which is pretty normal. I don't read a lot of nonfiction. I don't have a desire to read much nonfiction, so I'm not doing any sort of challenge that involves reading more nonfiction books. I wouldn't expect any more than maybe 2 or 3 or none nonfiction books from me in a year. So actually me reading 2 of them, I remember I read them back to back towards the beginning of 2021. That's pretty par for the course, so not really a big surprise there. 2 nonfiction books. Most of the science fiction and fantasy books I read this year were adult sci-fi fantasy. That's where my main focus was, where my main interest was, and that's going to be true going into 2022 as well. I don't plan to be doing a lot of YA reading other than the occasional one here or there that's a highly anticipated read for me. But in 2021, I did manage to read about 14 YA books in all. Not all of those were science fiction fantasy books. Some of them were like queer romance books. But for the most part, it's going to be an adult reading year, just like last year. I read 14 YA of mixed genres. Okay, next, moving on to representation. So I've just dived into an in-depth look at queer representation in the books I read in 2021. I did try to read more books with people of color and by authors of color. However, when I went back to do these stats, it just ended up being a lot of work to try to like parse out which books had people of color or were by authors of color. So I just tried to focus on the queer elements for this particular video, even though one of my goals for 2022 is to read more books by authors of color, especially in the science fiction and fantasy genre. So hopefully this time next year when I'm doing a stats video, that'll be a lot more of a relevant statistic than it was this year. Next, to jump into the queer representation statistics, I have this broken up into 6 different categories, starting with gay. So when I say gay, I mean books that had a male character that was interested in other male characters or had a male-male romance at its center. So there were 16 male-male books. That's one of my focuses in 2022, is to read more books that are own voices from gay male authors. So much of the representation for gay men that we see in fiction, especially like the rom-com genre, is written by females. So it'll be male-male romances written by female authors. And that's kind of problematic. So I'm definitely looking for more of that written by men. And again, not necessarily like in the rom-com genre, just looking for male-male romances or male-male relationships that are written by gay male authors. A great example of that is going to be the tarot card sequence by K.D. Edwards. Features a lot of queer representation, but the main romance is a male-male romance. And of course, K.D. Edwards is also a queer male author. So that's the sort of stuff we're looking for. I only got 16 of those in 2021, so hopefully in 2022 that number will be a lot larger. Next, and there's no surprise here, it's going to be Sapphic representation in 2021. So out of the 88 books I read, 27 of them involve some sort of Sapphic character or Sapphic relationship. Honestly, I thought that number was going to be higher as well, because it seemed like I was just reading all the gay books this year. But 27 is certainly not bad. It's the most, it's the heaviest category in this queer representation bracket. So most of the books I read were Sapphic or had Sapphic characters in them. And of course, that's what I'm here for. It's probably what I'm looking for the most in general. So no big surprise there. Next category I have is bisexual characters. So of course, bi erasure is a big problem, not only in works of fiction, such as books, but also in mainstream movies and television shows, and just sort of in general, bi erasure is a big problem. So I wanted to be sure to point out the bi characters that I did encounter in my books this year. And often the bi characters that I discovered were a surprise to me. I didn't go into the book expecting there to be a bisexual character, but they ended up being there, and that was always a pleasant surprise. I only read 10 books this year with a bi character, and usually it's not explicit, like explicitly stated that a character's bi. It's something that I kind of have to infer just based off their romantic or sexual history. Sorry, the cats are being stupid. Next is going to be ace or asexual characters. I could only recall 5 different instances of there being an ace character in the books I read this year. Again, kind of like bisexual, this is another one that is very rarely clearly stated, especially since I'm reading so much science fiction and fantasy books. It's very rare that a character just comes out and says, oh yeah, I'm asexual. So it's something you just sort of have to infer based on the character's personality, their romantic or sexual history, or in this case, their lack thereof, and just sort of the feelings that they're expressing in the text. Based off of all that, I discovered that I had read 5 books that contained 1 or more ace characters. Some of those books were all in the same series, such as Jen Lyon's Chorus of Dragons series. The first book is Ruin of Kings. That series contains not 1, but 2 ace or aromantic characters. So a majority of the books in that category were from that same series. Next up is going to be trans or non-binary characters featured in books. I was able to locate 11 based in the books I read, so 11 out of 88. And honestly, that's more than I even expected because I wasn't looking for a lot of trans books this year, even though that's something I hope to do better with in 2022. However, some of them snuck up on me, which is great. One of those would be The Drowning Girl by Caitlin R. Kieran. I didn't expect there to be a trans character in that, but actually the main love interest in The Drowning Girl is a trans woman. So that was a happy surprise. 11 out of 88 books with trans or non-binary characters. Um, it's also important to note that a lot of those, especially the non-binary characters, in science fiction and fantasy, they tend to be either like AI characters or robotic characters of some kind, or possibly even alien characters. And this is, to some extent, a harmful trope to sort of other non-binary people and trans people as well. But just given the genre of science fiction and fantasy, that is a lot of what you find, and it's not always done in a malicious intent, of course. That just is the way that it can be perceived when it's such an overwhelming amount of the representation. And it is true that out of most of those 11, a lot of those characters were either aliens, some sort of AI or robotic system, or just other non-human entities. Hopefully we'll be getting more representation of actual human individuals in science fiction and fantasy that identify as trans or non-binary. If you know of any good science fiction or fantasy books with that kind of representation, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to see it. And last but not least, polyamorous is my final category. It's not a category I expected to have a lot in because I wasn't like looking for polyamorous books, but again, Jen Lyon's Chorus of Dragons trilogy, not trilogy, sorry, it's got 5 books, not a trilogy. But Jen Lyon's Chorus of Dragons has a lot of queer representation just all across the board, including ace and aromantic representation, and also it has a polyamorous relationship kind of at its center. You could call it like the main romance is a polyamorous romance. So I have 4 instances of polyamory in the books that I read. Most of those are in the Chorus of Dragons series, but also Martha Wells' Murderbot series. One of the human characters that Murderbot gets involved with is Murderbot's found family. That person is a polyamorous practitioner, and I think in that world, polyamory is pretty normal, or at least on the planet that person's from, there is a lot of polyamorous relationships. So if you're looking for that, it's not a major part of the Murderbot books, but I thought it was worth mentioning since I had these categories going. Okay, and lastly, I want to talk about my ratings for the books I read in 2021. So I don't really love star rating systems. I talk about them a little bit in my video just because that's how people are used to books being reviewed. But it's not a way that I feel accurately represents the way I might feel about a book towards the end of it. It's just not nuanced enough, especially if it's only 5-star, like a 5-star scale. Something like a 10-star scale might be a lot more accurate and sort of nuanced, but I don't want to get into all those sort of stars right now. So instead, I've just got 5 categories of like rating. So the first being loved, and then liked, disappointed, disliked, and then lastly is going to be DNF'd, so books that I did not finish. So out of the 88 books that I read this year, I loved 22 of them, which I think isn't bad. When I say loved, I mean like this book just was a delight. Like it made my day, it made my week, my month. I still think about it all the time, that sort of thing. So a book that I just absolutely love and cannot recommend highly enough, that would be in the loved category, and there are 22 of those this year. Right below that were 45 books in liked, so that's typically just a book that it didn't blow my mind, but I enjoyed it. It had a lot of elements that I liked. If it was in a series, I'll probably be continuing on with that series. And in general, I just had a lot of good things to say about it, but it wasn't perfect or it wasn't mind-blowing. Next is going to be books that disappointed me. So that's 16 out of 88 books disappointed me this year. That number is a lot bigger than I would like it to be, but I had a lot of high expectations for so many books this year, a lot of anticipated reads, and some of them just didn't stand up to the hype or to my expectations, which is normal and not necessarily a bad thing. Just because a book's in this category doesn't mean that it was bad, and it doesn't mean that I didn't like it. It just means that it turned out to be very different than what I originally expected, and because of that, I didn't enjoy it quite as much as I had hoped to. Next is going to be disliked. So these are books that just straight up did not work for me, that I didn't like. If it's in a series, I won't be continuing with that series, and it's probably a strike against the author as well. I'm not saying I'll never read something else by them, but it just didn't sit right with me. There were only 2 of those in that category this year. So 2 out of 88 dislikes, that's pretty good. Like, if I only disliked 2, I mean, I call that a successful year, right? And last but not least, but DNF, so books I did not finish. There were only 3 of those this year, so good for me. Like, I did a good job. If I'm remembering correctly, that was The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin, so I didn't finish the Broken Earth trilogy. Surrender Your Sons, I can't remember that author's name, but I didn't finish that one, even though I read it to like 75% or something. I just wasn't interested. And then the very last one...
A few moments later.
And A Child of a Mad God by R.A. Salvatore. So those are the 3 that I didn't finish this year, and honestly, no regrets. No sense in wasting my time. Okay, that about wraps it up. I did want to point out that 7 out of my 88 reads this year were rereads. So I reread Gideon the Ninth, Shiver by Maggie Shiver. I reread the Shades of Magic trilogy by V.E. Schwab. What else? I reread Bloody Rose by Nicholas Eames. I think that's all. But yeah, 7 out of the 88 books I read this year were rereads. I do count rereads towards my overall reading goal because why not? It's another book that I read. And some books are just so good, I gotta come back to them time and time again. So those are my stats for 2021. I read 88 books. Not too much of a mix of genre. Most were sci-fi and fantasy. I had a good mix of queer books in there, and I just hope to up that number in 2022. Just give me all the queer books, all the queer science fiction fantasy books. I did 7 rereads. I liked 22, only DNF'd 3. So I think 2021 ultimately came out pretty well, and I'm even more excited to see what happens in 2022. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you soon. Goodbye.